The first Native Americans. Black Native Americans were the first American farmers. There's a popular myth that Europeans learned their farming methods from sub-Saharan African slaves, and that sub-Saharan African slaves were brought to America because Native Americans were supposed to be too lazy to be farmers. Because many mongoloid Native Americans were nomads, the black Native Americans who lived throughout America did practice agriculture. The first Americans were blacks from Africa. As early as 100,000 BC, Paleo-Americans from Africa had settled in Brazil. The Paleo-Americans were hunter-gatherers. The archaeological evidence makes it clear that mongoloid Native Americans appear in an archaeological context only 6,000 years before the present. It appears that black Native Americans dominated the states of Washington, Oregon, and California. There were black Native American tribes in Wyoming and the Dakotas. As a result, the mongoloid Native Americans mainly migrated into the United States southwest, and through the southwest they infiltrated into Mexico, Mesoamerica, and South America. Much of what is now Georgia was the stronghold of the black Native Americans. These blacks lived predominantly from the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina, southward as far as St. Augustine, Florida. There were also black Native Americans throughout the American Northeast and up into Canada. The vast majority of Native Americans lived in California and along the eastern seaboard in North America. They belonged to many confederations, including the Muskhogean and the Algonquin. Some of their tribal names include the Choctaw, Tuscarora, Secolan, Tamacraw, Nanticoke, Kashita, and Yamasee, to name a few. The black Native Americans mainly belonged to the Muskhoean and Algonquin Confederations. Due to the intimate relationship between the black Native Americans and Mongoloid tribes, the black Native Americans had passed on to the Mongoloid Native Americans Haplogroup R1, which originated in Africa. The black Native Americans lived on valuable farmlands during the colonial period. The English and Americans wanted this land. This led to violent conflicts between black Native Americans and white Americans. In New England, the black Native Americans were eliminated by slaving, warfare, and forced removal. The French enslaved Native Americans around the Great Lakes, Minnesota, Missouri Country, and Louisiana. The Europeans also needed labor to work the fields. The Americans provided the Native Americans with guns and cheap goods to purchase other Native Americans and made them slaves. Between 1670 and 1720, many black Native Americans were enslaved. The black Native Americans were sold in slavery throughout the 13 colonies, Canada, and the British West Indies. The majority of black Native Americans sold into slavery by whites and Indian slave traders were the Choctaw and Yamasee and other Carolina tribes. Mongoloid Native Americans were usually nomads. The archaeological evidence indicates that the Mongoloid Indians only arrived in the United States 6,000 years ago. Mongoloid Native Americans learned to farm from black Native Americans. Many of these black Native Americans had built the mounds and lived in the mounds. They were usually built along rivers, lakes throughout the United States. The Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri mound sites are located on hilltops overlooking valleys and are clearly defensive works covering many acres with formidable walls of earth, sometimes reinforced by stone, all evidently chosen for their impregnability. In lowland areas where there were probably few inhabitants or unsettled land, the mounds are various geometrical enclosures, octagons, circles, squares, ellipses. These mounds were more than likely built without military intentions. The defensive-style mounds found in the United States had lines of embankment, which averaged between 5 to 30 feet high, with enclosures hundreds of acres wide. Leading out from many of these enclosures, there often were parallel walls, many miles long, forming great avenues. Viner felt that these mounds resembled African cities of Luanga in the Congo, and the ancient city-states of Benin. W. E. Du Bois noted, the mounds of the mound builders were probably replicas of Negro forts in Africa. That this tendency to build forts and stockades proceeded from the Antilles, whence the Arawaks had come in the beginning of the 16th century, is proved by the presence of similar works in Cuba. These are found in the most abandoned and least explored parts of the island, and there can be little doubt that there were locations of fugitive Negro Indian stockades, precisely such as were in use in Africa. The only occupied mounds seen by Europeans were built by the African slaves, the Arawak Indians, and the black Native Americans in Florida. Hernando de Soto, the only European to see occupied mounds, tells us much about their construction and use. De Soto and his men discussed the mounds they found among the Florida Indians. Here, as mentioned earlier, some African black people. De Soto noted that at Ucinta, Florida, the town was of 7 or 8 houses built of timber and covered with palm leaves. The chief's house stood near the beach upon a very high mound made by hand for defense. At the other end of the town was a temple. It is interesting to note that in Florida, one of the major ethnic groups living there was the Yamasee or Yamasee people, which were described as blacks. The mounds in the United States are usually found near rivers. In the Ohio Valley, 10,000 mounds have been discovered. In the north, the mound zone begins in New York and extended along the southern shore of Lake Erie into what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, and on to the states of Iowa and Nebraska. In the southern United States, the mounds lined the Gulf of Mexico from Florida to eastern Texas and extended up through the Carolinas and across the state of Oklahoma. The mounds of ancient America follow the lines of the Mississippi, Ohio River and outlying regions as well. They vary in size from colossal mounds in Illinois to mere blisters rising from the earth. Most, if not all, of these mounds had long been abandoned by their former inhabitants when they were discovered. Many excavated mounds have yielded human bones, weapons, tools, inscriptions, and jewelry. Statues of Africans have also been found in these mounds. As there were 2 types of African statues found in the ancient mounds excavated in the Western Sahara, Africoid statues of type 1, i.e. humanoids in a sitting position with their hands on the thigh and right knee pointing up, while the other knee is resting on the ground, are found in Tennessee and Indiana at the Angel site. The most common type, style 2, i.e. statues of humanoids in a sitting position with their hands placed across the chest, have also been found in Etowah and Temple Mound sites in Tennessee and Georgia. It is also interesting that anthropomorphic statues found in Polk County, Georgia, are analogous to statues found in Mauritania. One of the major mound sites inhabited in North America was that of the Adena culture in Ohio. The Adena culture existed from 200 BC to AD 400 or 500 AD. Black Africans are characterized as being broad-faced, full-look, illustrating pronasticism, large bone with fleshy noses. Samuel Morton in Crania Americana, written in 1839, note that Adena people possess ponderous bony structures, large jaws, and broad faces. This description of the Adena fits exactly the description of the West African type. The Adena or Hopewell culture, as we call it today, was a dominant force in the United States during this period. They have left numerous copper bracelets, rings, stone tablets, and effigy pipes made in the form of Africans. At the Great Spirit Mound in Adams County, Ohio, a gold breastplate has also been found. Professor F.W. Putnam also mentioned the discovery of an Egyptian-looking figure in these mounds. Most archaeologists believe that agriculture began in the United States among the mound builders. The Adena Indians began agriculture in the United States. Using tools made from animal bone, tortoise shell, and stone, the Adena people grew many crops, including maize, squash, pumpkins, gourds, squash, and sunflowers. Corn, beans, and squash are 3 main agricultural crops of the black Native Americans. They were considered inseparable by the black Native Americans, and thus they were given the name 3 Sisters. The Adena mound builders used their mounds for habitation. They also buried their dead in the mounds. By 100 BC, another group of mound builders replaced the Adena people. This new population was the Hopewell people. The Hopewell people grew many crops, including corn and squash. The black Native Americans used two principal farming methods: rotational farming and the three-sister farming method. The rotational farming method required the black Native Americans to plant a crop for 3 to 5 years. After this period of time, they would clear new land and plant a new crop. The black Native Americans rotated the farmland because they felt the soil would be ruined due to the overuse of the land. Black Native Americans used the three-sister farming method. The three sisters are the three principal crops cultivated by the black Native Americans: corn, tapari or common beans, and squash. These three crops thrived together. The three-sister method was beneficial to all three crops. First, the farmers would make a mound and plant the corn. After the corn had begun to grow, the black Native Americans would plant climbing beans around the corn. The corn stalk served as a pole for the beans. Here we can see a Tamacraw woman in Florida working in agriculture side by side with men. Men plowed and women planted seeds and maize. Here we see another black Native American collecting Kauche in California. There was a symbiotic relationship between the beans, the corn, and the corn. The beans helped to add to the nitrogen to the soil to nourish the corn. Finally, the black Native Americans would plant squash. The squash provides ground cover and shade. The squash helped the soil retain moisture. Native Americans also cultivated tobacco. It appears that tobacco was being cultivated by black Native Americans as early as 300 AD in Illinois. The black Native Americans smoked the tobacco in their pipes. By the 1500s, tobacco was taken back to Europe. Shortly after this, Europeans began to cultivate tobacco in Virginia, and black Native Americans were enslaved and forced to cultivate tobacco. Later, the black Native Americans were joined by sub-Saharan Africans on the large European tobacco plantations in Virginia. In conclusion, it is a myth that Europeans learned their farming methods from sub-Saharan African slaves, and that sub-Saharan African slaves were brought to America because Native Americans were supposed to be too lazy to be farmers. This video makes it clear black Native Americans already had advanced farming methods thousands of years before sub-Saharan African slaves came to North